October 26, 1597. In the turbulent waters of the Myeongyang Strait, the salt air is thick with a tension that precedes death. From the deck of his flagship, a lone Panoxion creaking beneath his feet, Admiral Yi Sun-sin watches a personal hell materialize on the horizon. It is not a fleet, it is a moving forest of masts, a plague of timber and sail stretching from one end of the sea to the other. More than 130 Japanese warships, an invincible armada sent to deal the death blow to a nation already on its knees. The morning sun glints off the tips of their spears and the helmets of thousands of veteran samurai, a sinister gleam that promises certain and imminent annihilation for the small Joseon kingdom. Terror is a disease that has spread swiftly through his small flotilla. Behind him, his own captains, commanding the other 11 ships that constitute all that remains of the Korean Navy, are paralyzed by fear. Their vessels keep their distance, refusing to advance towards certain death. Pleas and orders have been useless. Fear is an anchor heavier than any made of iron. Admiral Yi is utterly alone, his flagship an island of defiance in an ocean of despair. The enemy draws near, confident and overwhelming, ready to devour this last vestige of resistance. The battle seems lost before the first cannon is fired, an inevitable conclusion written in the overwhelming arithmetic of war. But Yi Sun-sin is not looking at the monstrous fleet bearing down on him. His gaze, calm and penetrating, is fixed on something far more fundamental, the water itself. His eyes read the surface of the strait, not as a sailor, but as a master of nature. He observes the eddies, feels the invisible pull of the tide, and listens to the lament of the water as it is forced through the 300-meter-wide bottleneck. To the Japanese, the strait is merely the path to their prey. To the Korean captains, it is the stage for their execution. But to Yi, the treacherous, murderous currents of Myeongyang are not an obstacle. They are his only weapon, a secret and violent ally that only he knows how to unleash. The Japanese armada sailing toward Myeongyang was the embodiment of confidence and power. Led by proven commanders like Todo Takatora and the aggressive Kurushima Michifusa, this fleet was not a mere invasion force, but an executioner's blade. They came from a crushing victory at the Battle of Chilcholyang, where they had all but annihilated the Joseon Navy. In that battle, Yi's incompetent rival, Admiral Won Gyun, had led more than 160 Korean ships into a disastrous trap, losing almost all of them. This victory had inflated Japanese arrogance into absolute certainty. For them, the war at sea was over. What remained was merely a cleanup operation against insignificant remnants. The Japanese naval force was a spectacle of might. At least 133 warships, though some sources raised the figure to over 300, formed a formidable vanguard. Their ships, the swift and maneuverable Atakibune and Sekibune, were designed for one primary purpose: close quarters combat. Each vessel was packed with veteran samurai, warriors hardened by years of civil war in Japan and the brutal campaign in Korea. Their tactic was simple, direct, and until now, incredibly effective. Use their speed to close in, fire a volley of arquebuses to sow chaos, and then use grappling hooks to latch and board, turning the naval battle into a bloody land fight on the ship's decks, where their superior katana skills were decisive. The contempt the Japanese commanders felt for what remained of the Korean fleet was total. They considered Yi Sun-sin's 12 ships not a fleet, but an epilogue, the last survivors of a disaster they themselves had engineered. This hubris became their fatal blind spot. They did not bother to study the geography of the battlefield ahead. To them, the Myeongyang Strait was just a strip of water, a geographical inconvenience on their way to the Korean capital. They completely ignored local reports of its savage currents and treacherous nature. They firmly believed that their overwhelming numerical superiority and the ferocity of their samurai warriors could overcome any tactical or natural obstacle. Brute force, they believed, was the only variable that mattered. Driven by this blind confidence, they sailed directly into Yi's trap. They saw no need for caution, reconnaissance, or cunning. Their plan was simple: advance en masse, surround the few Korean ships, and crush them under the weight of their numbers. The idea that a single man, commanding a dozen demoralized ships, could pose a serious threat was, to them, laughable. They did not know that they were about to face not just an admiral, but a master strategist who had turned his desperate weakness into his greatest strength and who was about to use the Japanese's own arrogance as the bait for the most perfect naval ambush in history. Facing this tide of steel and arrogance stood a man who was the personification of resilience. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not a celebrated hero at that moment. He was a man who had been dragged from hell. Months earlier, he had fallen victim to a court conspiracy, fueled by the envy of his rivals and the paranoia of his king. He was stripped of his rank, arrested, dragged to the capital in chains, brutally tortured, and sentenced to death. Only a last-minute intervention commuted his sentence, and he was humiliated by being demoted to the rank of a common foot soldier, forced to fight in the ranks as an ordinary man. He had lost his fleet, his honor, and on the road to his exile, he received the news that his elderly mother had died, her heart broken by her son's disgrace. His return to command was not a triumph, but an act of pure national desperation. After the annihilation of the Korean fleet under Won Gyun, the terrified king had no choice but to reinstate the only man who had proven capable of defeating the Japanese. When Yi was restored as supreme naval commander, the navy handed to him was a ghost. Only 12 Panoxion ships remained, the sturdy Korean warships that were essentially floating artillery platforms. The crews were composed of survivors from the previous disaster, men who were deeply demoralized, terrified, and had little faith in their chances of survival. The weight on Yi's shoulders was unimaginable. The fate of a nation depended on a dozen broken ships and broken-spirited men. The motivation for Yi and his men was the most primal and powerful of all: survival. They were not fighting for glory or conquest. They were Korea's last line of defense. If Yi's fleet fell at Myeongyang, there would be nothing to stop the Japanese armada from sailing up the west coast, linking up with their land army, and marching directly on the capital, Hanyang. The fall of the capital would mean the collapse of the Joseon dynasty and the total subjugation of their people. Every sailor on those 12 ships, despite their fear, knew they were not defending a mere strategic position. They were defending their homes, their families, and the very existence of their nation. It was a fight to the end. Yi Sun-sin, despite the torture and humiliation, remained stoic and determined. His leadership was not based on grandiloquent speeches, but on a calm competence that inspired a grudging confidence. When the government urged him to abandon the Yi, fight at sea and join his few forces with the army on land, Yi flatly refused. In a famous letter to the king, he declared, "Your humble servant still has 12 warships under his command. As long as I live, the enemy will not dare to despise us." This was not the statement of a man confident of victory, but of a man who had accepted his duty unto death. With everything against him, he prepared to make the Myeongyang Strait the tomb of Japanese ambition, or his own. You are about to witness the anatomy of a miracle. Not a miracle from the heavens, but one forged from the genius, courage, and desperation of a single man against an ocean of enemies. This is the story of how intelligence can become the greatest of weapons and how hope can flourish on the very edge of the abyss. If these tales of impossible victories and legends forged in the fire of battle are what drive you, then you have found your harbor. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and hit like to join our fleet. Help us navigate the currents of history and rescue these immortal heroes from oblivion. The genius of Yi Sun-sin lay not in new technology or a secret naval maneuver, but in his deep and humble understanding of nature. He knew that the Myeongyang Strait, whose name means the crying strait for the loud sound its currents produced, was no simple passageway. It was an aquatic beast, a monster of unimaginable power. At its narrowest point, less than 300 meters wide, the water from the vast southwestern sea was forced through, creating one of the fastest tidal currents in the world, reaching speeds of up to 10 knots. More importantly, this current was not constant. It was a clock of nature, predictably reversing its direction every few hours. To anyone unfamiliar with it, it was a death trap. To Yi, it was a weapon. His plan was a symphony of timing and geography, designed to turn the Japanese's greatest strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness. He knew he could not face 130 ships in open water. It would be suicide. Therefore, he chose the strait as his battlefield, a place where the massive Japanese fleet could not deploy. They would be forced to enter the strait in a long, narrow column, a deadly funnel that would negate their numerical advantage and force them to fight with only a few ships at a time. The strait itself would act as a force multiplier for his small fleet, leveling the playing field in a way the Japanese did not anticipate at all. The masterstroke of his plan was the use of the current. Yi had calculated the tides perfectly. His strategy was to lure the Japanese armada into the strait at the exact moment the current was flowing northward, that is, against their advance. This would have multiple devastating effects. First, it would drastically slow the Japanese advance, forcing them to fight not only the Korean cannons, but also the immense power of the ocean. Second, it would make their ships extremely difficult to maneuver, turning them into large, slow targets. And third, as more and more ships entered the strait to join the fight, the current holding them back would create a chaotic traffic jam, a bottleneck of vessels crashing into one another. But the genius did not end there. Yi knew that after a few hours, nature's clock would turn in his favor. The current would stop for a brief period of slack water before reversing its direction and beginning to flow violently southward. This was the moment he awaited for his counteroffensive. The same current that had been his defensive shield would become his battering ram. It would propel his 12 Panoxion forward with tremendous speed and force, straight into the disordered and crowded Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the current would drag the Japanese ships backward, increasing their chaos and making any organized retreat impossible. Yi did not just plan to use the strait to defend. He planned to turn the very tide into his main offensive weapon. At dawn on October 26th, a thick fog covered the sea, concealing the two fleets from each other. On the Japanese side, the atmosphere was one of impatience and confidence. Their scouts had confirmed the enemy's pathetic strength, a dozen ships. The samurai sharpened their katanas, anticipating a quick victory and a glorious slaughter. The commanders discussed not if they would win, but how quickly. The fog was a minor inconvenience, but it would soon lift, revealing their prey. For them, the day promised an easy victory that would finally open the way to the total conquest of Korea, a thought that filled their hearts with a feverish arrogance and a lust for blood. On the Korean side, the mood was one of quiet dread. The fog was not a cloak of concealment, but a curtain delaying the inevitable. The sailors stared south, toward the direction of the unseen enemy, and prayed to their ancestors. The memory of the Chilcholyang massacre was fresh in their minds. Many of them had seen their comrades die in that catastrophe. Their captains, gathered on Yi's flagship, had spent the night arguing against the battle, pleading for a retreat. The idea of facing a fleet more than 10 times their size seemed like suicidal madness, not a strategy. The fear was as thick as the fog itself. Amid this atmosphere of terror, Admiral Yi Sun-sin projected a calm that seemed almost superhuman. He spent the early morning hours observing the currents, confirming his calculations. Then, he gathered his terrified captains. He did not shout at them or threaten them. Instead, he spoke with cold logic and steel-like resolve. He reminded them that there was nowhere to run, and that a death in battle, defending their nation, was more honorable than an execution for desertion. He ended with a phrase that would become legend, a perfect distillation of the warrior's philosophy. Those willing to seek death will live. Those who seek to save their own life will die. When the fog finally began to lift, the horrifying reality was revealed. The southern horizon was black with the Japanese armada, a sight that made the heart of every Korean sailor sink. There were even more than they had imagined, a seemingly infinite force advancing with relentless confidence. The moment of truth had arrived. The Japanese war drums began to beat, a sinister pulse that echoed across the water, the soundtrack to the coming annihilation. The 11 Korean captains, despite their admiral's words, hesitated, their ships holding back. The Japanese fleet entered the strait, expecting to find a line of battle. Instead, they found a single ship, sailing directly toward them. The vanguard of the Japanese armada, composed of its fastest ships and fiercest warriors, entered the mouth of the Myeongyang Strait with a roar of drums and war cries. Their confidence was absolute. They expected to see the 12 Korean ships in a desperate defensive formation, ready to be swallowed. But what they saw perplexed them. Only a single Korean warship, Admiral Yi's own flagship, was advancing to meet them. At a safe distance behind it, the other 11 Korean ships remained motionless, like terrified spectators at their own execution. To the Japanese, it was an incomprehensible sight. Was it a trap? or was it the madness of a single man? They decided it was the latter and swarmed upon their lone prey. At that moment, Admiral Yi Sun-sin was fighting two battles, one against the Japanese armada bearing down on him, and another against the fear of his own men. As his ship moved forward, he saw the hesitation of his subordinates. Using flag signals, he frantically ordered them to advance, but his ships did not move. He was completely alone. Yi's flagship became the sole dike against a flood of enemy ships. Dozens of Japanese vessels surrounded it, forming a circle of death around him. The air filled with arrows and arquebus shot, which clattered against the thick pine. Planks of the Panoxion. The most one-sided battle in naval history had begun. Yi's vessel transformed into a floating fortress. Unlike the Japanese ships built for boarding, the Panoxion was a superior gunnery platform, with a stronger hull and dozens of cannons of various sizes. Yi used this advantage with masterful skill. As the Japanese ships tried to close in to board, the Korean flagship unleashed devastating broadsides in all directions. The heaven, earth, black, and yellow cannons roared, spewing cannonballs and massive iron arrows that shattered the lighter hulls of the Japanese ships, split their masts, and swept their decks clear of samurai. Yi's ship turned and maneuvered in the strong current, a cornered giant fighting with desperate fury, refusing to fall. For nearly an hour, Admiral Yi's flagship fought alone against a significant portion of the Japanese fleet. It was one of the greatest and bravest displays of leadership and courage in the history of warfare. Every time a Japanese ship got close enough to throw grappling hooks, it was met by a point-blank volley of cannon fire that blew it apart or forced it to fall back. Despite the damage and casualties, the flagship's crew, inspired by the incredible calm of their admiral, who remained on the command deck despite the danger, fought with the strength of 10 men. They sank several ships and damaged dozens more, creating a perimeter of floating wreckage around them. They were alone, outnumbered, but miraculously still afloat. The Japanese commander Kuroshima Michifusa, a former pirate known for his aggressive temper, watched the incredible resistance of Yi's ship with rising fury. The humiliation was unbearable. His mighty armada was being held at bay by a single vessel. Impatient and blinded by arrogance, he decided to end the spectacle personally. He led a direct charge with his own squadron, ordering more and more ships into the strait to overwhelm the Korean flagship by sheer force. This was the impulsive move Yi had been waiting for. Kuroshima's aggression led him straight into the trap. The Japanese fleet, in its haste to join the slaughter, piled into the narrow bottleneck, creating a chaotic and unmanageable naval traffic jam. From a distance, the other 11 Korean captains watched the superhuman spectacle. They saw their admiral, whom they had abandoned, fight alone against impossible odds, and not only survive, but inflict terrible damage on this enemy. Shame began to overcome their fear. At that moment, Yi, seeing that the Japanese fleet was fully committed and in disarray, made one last desperate appeal. He had his ship turn and feign a brief retreat, a ruse to draw the enemy in even further. Then, he hoisted a command flag that was not a request, but a direct order and an accusation. Do you wish to be tried by court-martial? Do you wish to flee and live? Death is the only alternative. Inspired by their admiral's resistance and shamed by their cowardice, the captains finally reacted. First one, then another, the remaining Korean ships began to advance into the fray. At the same time, the captain of a nearby civilian vessel, seeing Yi's struggle, bravely rammed his heavy ship into a Japanese vessel, adding to the confusion and giving the impression that reinforcements were arriving. The psychological tide of the battle was beginning to turn. The small, terrified Korean fleet was finally joining the fight, at the most critical moment. And then, the miracle that was not a miracle, but the result of perfect calculation, occurred. The ocean itself seemed to take a side. At that crucial moment, the tide, which had been flowing against the Japanese, reached its peak. For a brief, tense period, the water grew still, and then, with an audible groan, the current reversed its direction. Yi Sun-sin's clock of nature had struck. The powerful current of the Myeongyang Strait began to flow southward, now not against the Japanese, but directly at them, pushing them backward, while propelling the advancing Korean fleet forward like an invisible battering ram. The battlefield tilted suddenly and violently in favor of the Koreans. The trap, so carefully laid, had been sprung. The change of the current was catastrophic for the disorganized Japanese fleet. The powerful tide, now flowing against them, halted their advance and began to push them back. The ships in the rear were driven into those in the vanguard, causing a series of chain reaction collisions. Rudders were smashed, oars were broken, and control was completely lost. The strait, already a chaotic jam, became a whirlpool of destruction. The Japanese ships, designed to be fast and agile, became ungovernable, crashing into one another in total confusion. Panic replaced arrogance. Commanders screamed orders that no one could follow, drowned out by the roar of the water and the thunder of the Korean cannons. Meanwhile, for the small Korean fleet, the reversed current was a blessing. Their 12 Panoxion, now propelled by the tide, charged forward with renewed speed and momentum. They became predators pouncing on a helpless, trapped herd. With the Japanese fleet crowded together and unable to maneuver, the Korean gunners could not miss. They fired broadsides at point-blank range into the mass of enemy ships. Every cannonball found a target, shattering hulls, sweeping decks, and sowing indescribable carnage. The Koreans, who minutes before were paralyzed by fear, now fought with a vengeful fury, their morale soaring as they saw the giant enemy thrown into chaos. In the midst of the confusion, the flagship of Kuroshima Michifusa was identified. Yi Sun-sin ordered his ships to concentrate their fire on it. The Japanese commander's vessel was riddled with cannon fire. Soon, it was disabled, a floating target. In a final act of audacity, Korean sailors threw grappling hooks, reversing the Japanese tactic, and stormed the ship. In the fierce fighting on deck, Kuroshima Michifusa was killed. His body was pulled from the water. And then, Yi Sun-sin did something brutally effective. He ordered the Japanese commander's head to be cut off and displayed at the top of his own flagship's mast. The sight of their commander's decapitated head, waving like a macabre banner, completely broke what was left of the Japanese fighting spirit. It was a devastating psychological blow. Their leader was dead. Their fleet was in uncontrollable chaos, and they were being slaughtered by a force that was not supposed to exist. The will to fight was replaced by the instinct to survive. The only thought in every Japanese captain's mind was to escape the hell of the Myeongyang Strait. But the same current that had trapped them now prevented their escape. The retreat became a desperate, chaotic rout, and the slaughter reached its peak. With the total collapse of Japanese morale, the battle turned into a hunt. The Korean fleet, now in full control of the strait, moved with lethal efficiency, picking their targets at will. The Japanese ships, fighting the current and themselves, were easy prey. The Korean Panoxion, acting in concert, created a crossfire, their cannons roaring without cease. The strait, already filled with wreckage and bodies, became a cauldron of fire, smoke, and blood-red water. The samurai, so fearsome on land, drowned in the sea, their heavy armor dragging them to the depths. The Japanese ships that managed to break free from the initial jam attempted a desperate flight. However, as they exited the strait, they were met by the rest of the Korean fleet, which cut off their retreat. The carnage continued in more open waters. The superiority of the Korean artillery was now overwhelming. They could destroy the Japanese ships from a distance where the enemy's arquebuses were ineffective. The Japanese, whose main tactic was boarding, could not even get close. They were systematically dismantled, one ship after another, by a force that fought with an intelligence and fury they had never believed possible. By the end of the day, the Myeongyang Strait was a naval graveyard. 31 Japanese warships lay at the bottom of the sea, and at least 90 more were so badly damaged they were useless for combat. Thousands of Japan's finest warriors had perished, either by cannon fire, drowning, or in hand-to-hand combat. The mighty armada that had entered the strait that morning, with absolute arrogance, had been, for all practical purposes, annihilated. It had been a defeat so complete, so total, that it defied all logical explanation for those who had not been there. And on the Korean side, the result was even more incredible. Of the 12 ships that had entered the battle, all 12 survived. Not a single ship was lost. Casualties among the Korean crews were minimal, barely a few dozen wounded and a handful of dead. The loss ratio was astronomical, an achievement without precedent in the history of naval warfare. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the man who had been disgraced and tortured, the man who had fought an armada alone, had achieved not just a victory, but a tactical miracle that would be etched in the annals of history forever as the most impossible of triumphs. The collapse of the Japanese fleet at Myeongyang was more than just a military defeat. It was the implosion of a strategy of conquest. The news of the fleet's annihilation spread like wildfire through the Japanese forces in Korea, sowing disbelief and panic. The Navy had not only been their main assault tool, but also the logistical lifeline connecting their expeditionary army in Korea to their supply bases in Japan. With the Navy shattered, that lifeline was severed. The vast Japanese army on land, which depended on resupply by sea, suddenly found itself isolated in hostile territory. Its northward advance halted in its tracks. The defeat broke the backbone of the Japanese offensive. Their plan for a swift conquest, based on a coordinated advance by land and sea, lay in tatters. The land army, now without the ability to receive supplies or reinforcements via the vital West Coast route, was forced to halt its march on the capital. Their momentum was completely lost. The war, which had seemed on the verge of ending in a Japanese victory, suddenly stalled. The genius of a single admiral in a single afternoon had dramatically shifted the strategic balance of the entire conflict, giving the besieged Joseon dynasty a vital respite and a chance to regroup. The psychological impact on the Japanese high command was profound. They had underestimated Yi Sun-sin, considering him a relic of the past, and they had paid a catastrophic price. The invincibility they felt after their victory at Chilchilyang evaporated. Fear and respect for Admiral Yi, whom they called the Sea Dragon, returned with renewed force. The sea, which they had considered theirs, had once again become their greatest enemy, not because of storms, but because of the presence of a man who seemed to command the very waves. The audacity and aggression that had characterized the second Japanese invasion were replaced by caution and uncertainty. The Battle of Myeongyang marks the definitive turning point in the Imjin War. Although the war would continue for another year, the initiative passed from Japanese hands to the Koreans and their Chinese allies. Yi Sun-sin's naval victory not only saved the Sa Navy from total annihilation, but ultimately saved the nation itself. It is one of the clearest examples in history of how a single battle, at the right place and the right time, can have strategic consequences that alter the fate of empires. The giant, blinded by arrogance, had been brought down not by an equal force, but by the brilliant mind of a single man. As the sun set over the strait, the scale of the Korean victory became painfully clear. The waters, once blue, were stained red and covered with debris, splintered planks, tattered sails, broken oars, and the bodies of thousands of Japanese soldiers. The crying strait had lived up to its name, but on this day, it cried for the invaders. For the Korean sailors, exhausted and covered in gunpowder, the sight was both horrific and euphoric. They had entered the battle expecting to die, and instead, they had emerged as the masters of a naval graveyard of their own making. The silence that followed the battle was more eloquent than any victory cry. The statistics of the carnage tell a story that defies belief. On the Japanese side, 31 frontline warships were sunk. At least 90 more were so damaged that they were out of action, many of them scuttled by the Japanese themselves in their chaotic retreat. Human losses were in the thousands, with estimates exceeding 10,000 men killed and wounded. The Japanese chain of command was decapitated, with the death of the aggressive commander Kuroshima Michifusa, and the humiliation of the surviving commanders. It was a naval catastrophe from which Hideyoshi's invasion force would never fully recover. On the Korean side, the result was, in the most literal sense of the word, miraculous. Of the 12 ships that faced the Japanese armada, not a single one was lost. The casualties were astonishingly low. Records indicate only 2 sailors killed and 3 wounded on Admiral Yi's flagship. The disparity is so extreme, it seems like a typographical error in the history books. A fleet of 12 ships had destroyed or neutralized over 120 enemy vessels and killed thousands of soldiers, all while suffering almost no losses. There is no naval victory in the annals of recorded history that is so lopsided, so total, and so utterly decisive. The victory was absolute. There were no terms, no negotiations, only the annihilation of one force and the miraculous survival of the other. Admiral Yi, the man who had begun the day alone and abandoned by his own men, ended the day as the undisputed savior of his nation. There was no time for celebration. The night was spent making repairs, tending to the few wounded and preparing for the next phase of the war. But every Korean sailor, as they watched the burning wrecks of the Japanese fleet under the moonlight, knew they had taken part in something more than a battle. They had been witnesses to, and makers of, a legend. The echo of the cannons at Myeongyang resounded far beyond the shores of Korea, altering the course of East Asian history. The most immediate political and military consequence was the salvation of the Joseon dynasty. The battle stopped the Second Japanese invasion, which until that moment had seemed unstoppable, dead in its tracks. By severing the naval supply lines, Yi Sun-sin strangled the Japanese army on land, forcing it into a defensive position and eventually to retreat. Historians almost unanimously agree that without the victory at Myeongyang, Korea would likely have been conquered, forever changing the political and cultural map of the region. The battle was not just a tactical victory, it was the fulcrum upon which the fate of a nation turned. The event forever cemented Yi Sun-sin's status as Korea's greatest national hero, a figure revered to this day with almost religious fervor. His life became an epic of loyalty, perseverance, and strategic genius. Despite being betrayed by his own court, he never wavered in his duty to his people. His leadership at Myeongyang, where he stood alone against an armada, has become the ultimate expression of the Korean spirit, the ability to achieve the impossible through intelligence, indomitable courage, and an unbreakable will, even when on the brink of total annihilation. His name is invoked in times of national crisis as a reminder that hope is never lost. The Battle of Myeongyang became a foundational myth, a story told and retold through generations to inspire pride and resilience. It became the ultimate proof that a small nation, through cunning and valor, could resist much larger powers. The image of 12 ships defeating more than 130 has become a powerful national metaphor. In a country that has faced numerous invasions and occupations throughout its history, the story of Myeongyang serves as a cultural anchor, a constant reminder that a people's spirit is not measured by the size of their armies, but by the strength of their will to be free. Globally, the battle is studied in naval academies as one of the most extraordinary examples of tactical genius and asymmetrical warfare. It is a perfect case study of how a superior commander can exploit geography, weather, and enemy psychology to nullify an overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Yi Sun-sin is often compared to other great admirals in history, like Horatio Nelson, but many argue that his achievements, given the impossible circumstances he faced, are unparalleled. Myeongyang was not just a Korean victory, it was a universal testament to the power of the human mind over brute force. The legend of Myeongyang is often told as a story of superhuman confidence and infallible genius. But the truth, preserved in Admiral Yi's own words, is far more human and profound. On the night before the battle, as his men trembled with fear and the fate of his nation hung by a thread, Yi Sun-sin sat in his cabin and wrote in his war diary. His words are not those of a confident demigod, but of a mortal man bearing an unbearable weight. He wrote of the disaster that had befallen his nation, of the enemy's plans, and of his profound loneliness in this moment of supreme crisis. His diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, reveals the heart of a man on the edge of the abyss. He did not boast of his plan or predict a miraculous victory. Instead, he pleaded with the heavens, asking for the strength to punish the arrogant invaders. He had lost almost everything a man can lose: his rank, his reputation, the trust of his king, and most painfully, his beloved mother, whose death he still mourned. He had nothing left but his sense of duty, one last, stubborn thread of responsibility to his people. He was a man emptied of everything but his purpose. The greatest naval victory in history was born, therefore, not of arrogance or confidence, but of a resolve forged in the depths of despair. It was the product of a man who, having hit rock bottom, no longer had anything to fear from death. This vulnerability, this humanity, is what makes his achievement even more extraordinary. It was not a god of war who descended to save Korea, but a man with all his doubts and his pain, who chose to stand when all others had knelt, and who found in the darkness the clarity to see a path to victory that no one else could imagine. And so, Admiral Yi's immortal legacy is not just that of a brilliant strategist, but that of a human being who shows us the true meaning of resilience. He teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it, and that the greatest victories are often won not by those who have the most to gain, but by those who, having lost everything, discover that their duty is all they have left. The hero of Myeongyang was not invincible because he could not be defeated, but because even after being broken, he refused to stay down.